Okay, going further into our notes here. Actually, I need to back up a slide here. We're going to go and talk about injuries to the spine now, starting with cervical injuries. So, in the cervical area, these are fairly uncommon in athletics. Only about 6 to 7% of injuries are cervical injuries. But those that do have a cervical injury, um, it says greater than 90% of all fatalities are cervical related. So that's a little concerning. So although it's uncommon, when it happens, it's bad, generally speaking. So cervical injuries are primarily technique related, and you see this a lot in football, and maybe that's because of improper tackling technique. So spearing is going to be the primary cause of cervical injuries in football, where the tackle is made with the head instead of heads up tackling. Somebody's got their head down and they're ramming their head into another body. Now, sometimes you can't help it and it happens, but that's again why they've eliminated um, or penalized. You're penalized for spearing, in football because the injuries it causes. They don't want to tackle head first. That's going to cause compression fractures. If someone does go down with a injury in the cervical section, you need to have an emergency plan because, again, this can be really serious. So all the personnel, all the athletic trainers and doctors and coaches all need to know what their roles are, what equipment to use. Um, if an athlete is unconscious, you do have to suspect a head or neck injury and treat it as such. And you want to suspect the worst until proven otherwise. So you have to treat it like a cervical injury. Okay, go to the next slide here. Here's a picture. Spear tackling, again, would be leading with your head. And what can happen is the force of the collision is going to rip through this person's head and compress the bones here in the cervical region, and you can end up with a fracture. And then what can be really bad is if the fracture gets out of place and it were to lodge in the spinal cord. That's when it could be really serious. So this is not the greatest picture, but you can see this person here is bent over and leading with their head. So that's not good. All right. Going on, spine injuries in general, you could have fractures or dislocations. And if that happens, that could leave you very weak or paralyzed. If you do get damage to the spinal cord, it's pretty permanent. Your nerve tissue does not regenerate. It doesn't go through mitosis. So once it's damaged, it is pretty permanent. Um, these are some other common spine injuries here. They're called nerve root injuries because the spinal cord, which is right here in this picture, coming off of the spinal cord are spinal nerves, and those nerves will travel to your organs, to your extremities, that's and then give you feeling and sensation. So sometimes if there's damage to those nerves, if they're compressed at all, that's when you're going to get paralysis, numbness, tingling. So what are some nerve root injuries? What are some things that can cause that to happen? The number one cause of that a lot of times is a herniated disc. And I think we'll watch a video on herniated disc, but here is a picture of a herniated disc. So we have the disc, and remember, the disc is a lot of water, and it kind of ends up, according to my physical therapist, because I had a herniated disc, he said it's like a toothpaste consistency on the inside. And what happens is sometimes the toothpaste can come out of the tube. So if there's been some sort of an injury that smashes down the disc, I was in a car accident, so there was a force that kind of caused the gel in the disc to come backwards and moves and presses into the spinal cord. And of course, that then can impinge the flow of the electrical impulses that are going from the spinal nerves into your extremities. So I had real bad, like pins and needles feeling all the way down in my toes on both sides from a herniated disc. And that was in my L4, L5 lumbar vertebrae area. So that's what a herniated disc looks like. It's kind of like when the gel on the inside of the disc ends up flowing into the spinal cord and presses on the spinal cord, also called a bulging disc. Okay, you could also have lacerations. So if you had a real serious car accident, maybe where you actually ended up with some kind of cuts on the nerves themselves, that would be bad. Something called cord shock syndrome or central cord syndrome is going to be a compression to the nerves themselves, and that could take some time to recover from, or it can go pretty quickly. Just depends. Almost kind of like a bruise, kind of like bruising the spinal cord. Any hemorrhaging, if you had any bleeding that was pressing on those nerves, if you did in fact have a contusion, that would be swelling and pressing. Any tissue that's swollen around the nerves can press into the nerve also. And so that's what that's talking about. And then there's also something called spinal stenosis, which can be common, especially in older people who develop arthritis. And that's when you have then a narrowing of the openings in the spine. And then so these openings right here, there can be arthritis that builds up, and it starts to, the bone tissue itself starts to press on those nerves. And a lot of times you have to have sometimes surgery to kind of go in and get that cleaned out and open that passageway back up. So those are some of the types of nerve root injuries that leave people either with pins and needles or a loss of feeling and pain, can even have like a burning sensation. Back to a cervical injury that's common in sports, you have this area of spinal nerves here called the brachial plexus that runs C5 to T1 in this region. This is the brachial plexus that's showing right here. But this, if these nerves coming off, if those nerves get pinched, that's what you call a stinger. I know my husband played football and my son played football, and both of them had experienced stingers, which is where you can hit and the nerves either get stretched or they get compressed. It can be either one. They can get stretched or compressed, and then it leaves a very sharp, sometimes paralyzing pain, and can burn. It could be a burning sensation, and it can go all the way down your um, arm into your fingers, and it's temporary though. So you might come off like, oh my gosh, feeling like you've done some serious damage, and then after a couple minutes start to kind of regain feeling, and then within usually a half an hour or so it feels totally normal. But that's going to be a rapid compression or stretching of the nerves in that region. So that's called a stinger burner. Okay, this slide is talking about cervical disc, nerve impingement, fractures, dislocations. This is, again, signs and symptoms. So it could be any abnormal neurological function, could result with peripheral pain or paresthesia, which is going to be numbness on the sides, could be one side or the other, down in the arms or legs. Could have specific tenderness in a location. Now, if you had an athlete that was on a field and they were presenting with these kinds of signs and symptoms, then they need to get on a backboard and call 911. And then they really don't come back until they're cleared by a doctor. Pain-free, complete full range of motion, strength, and the doctor would have to approve all of that. A little bit more, if this was going to happen and you saw this on a field, about applying a cervical collar. So if it was a cervical injury, you'd want to apply a cervical collar. So once the EMT provides continuous manual inline support of the head, called inline stabilization, meaning you don't want that head to move. So somebody's going to hold the head, as you can see in this picture. Then you're going to make sure you have the proper size collar. They come in a couple different sizes. You want to place the collar so that it fits snugly under the chin. It wraps around the neck. You want to make sure it fits. Then that will keep the head in line with the spine, while you're en route to the hospital, so you're not moving around. And I have a video that I want to show, and you're going to see that next on inline stabilization.